The frost lay thick across the barbed wire that morning, each strand crystallized into something that caught the early light and threw it back in broken fragments. Captain James Hollis stood in the motor pool yard outside Landsberg am Lech, Bavaria, on the 22nd day of April in 1945, and for the third time since Reveille he opened the cylinder of his Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver and counted the brass casings nestled inside. 6 rounds, always 6. Never 7, never 5. The weapon felt light in his hand compared to the Colt 45s the infantry officers carried, those heavy chunks of American steel that could knock a charging man backwards and punch holes through engine blocks if the stories were to be believed. His .38 Special was a different animal entirely, smaller, quieter, built for a different kind of work, precision instead of power, controlled fire instead of overwhelming force. The serial number stamped into the frame read V479852, though he'd stopped checking it months ago. The bluing had worn smooth from 2 years of being drawn and holstered, a rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. The grips were walnut, darkened from the oil in his palms, fitted to his hand in a way that made the weapon feel less like a tool and more like an extension of his arm. He'd carried it through France and Belgium, through the frozen hell of the Ardennes when the winter of '44 tried to kill everyone who wasn't already being shot at, and now here into the dying days of a war that everyone knew was finished, except the men still fighting it. Around him in the yard, other officers moved through their morning routines with the casual efficiency of men who'd done the same things so many times they could do them drunk or half asleep or under fire. Lieutenant Morrison, fresh-faced and loud in the way that young officers often were when they hadn't seen enough death to quiet them down, caught sight of Hollis checking his sidearm and grinned that knowing grin that said he was about to say something he thought was clever. "What are you planning to do with that little thing, Captain? Tickle the Krauts until they surrender?" A couple of other lieutenants laughed, the kind of laughter that came easy when you were 23 and still believed in the romance of warfare. Hollis didn't answer, just spun the cylinder one more time, listened to the mechanical click of metal on metal, then snapped it shut with a flick of his wrist. The weight settled back into the holster on his hip, familiar and reassuring. He'd been a Chicago police officer for 4 years before the war, walking beats on the south side where backup was always too far away and every domestic disturbance could turn lethal in the space between heartbeats. He'd learned to shoot on the department range, where the instructors drilled into you that every bullet had a lawyer's name on it, and you'd better be able to justify where every single round went. The .45 was a fine weapon if your goal was to knock a man down and deal with the consequences later. The .38 was better if you wanted to hit exactly what you were aiming at and sleep at night knowing you hadn't put a round through someone's grandmother standing behind your target. Division Intelligence had flagged General Major Wilhelm Brandt for immediate transport to Corps headquarters earlier that week. He'd commanded artillery divisions during the Normandy campaign, coordinated fire missions around Cherbourg, and intelligence believed he possessed information about SS officers currently in hiding throughout southern Bavaria. The kind of information that could save lives if it prevented those officers from organizing resistance cells or disappearing into the civilian population with their crimes intact. Hollis had drawn the assignment through the particular bad luck that came with being competent, available, and not currently bleeding or dying. 87 miles through partially secured territory along Highway 17, heading south toward Munich through country that was technically liberated, but still dangerous in the way that all defeated landscapes are dangerous. Desperate men with weapons and nothing to lose made for unpredictable hazards. His colonel had found him that morning after the briefing, clapped him on the shoulder with the kind of forced camaraderie that officers used when they were sending you into something that might not work out, and said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "Try not to lose this one, James, and maybe see if you can borrow a real gun from somebody who won't miss it." The joke landed flat, the way jokes about inadequate weapons always did when you were about to drive 87 miles through country where deserters were known to operate, but Hollis had smiled anyway because that was what you did when colonels made jokes. "Yes, sir," he'd said, and meant none of it. Sergeant Daniel Kozak sat behind the wheel of the Willys Jeep now, fingers drumming an anxious pattern on the steering wheel while they waited for the prisoner to be brought out from the processing tent. Kozak was 23 years old, thin and wire-tight, with the kind of anger that had nowhere to go but inward, creating a man who gripped everything too hard and whose jaw muscles jumped and flexed when he was translating the things German prisoners said. He'd grown up in Milwaukee, speaking Hamburg dialect German with his grandmother, which made him invaluable as an interpreter and occasionally intolerable as a human being because he understood every muttered curse and whispered threat that came out of prisoner mouths. Most of the time, Hollis appreciated having him around. Sometimes, like now, when the kid's nervous energy was making the whole Jeep vibrate, Hollis wished for someone older and calmer and less likely to do something stupid. "You really think we're going to make it all the way to Kor with just the two of us?" Kozak asked, not for the first time that morning. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and he kept glancing at the tree line like he expected the forest to come alive with enemy fire any second now. "We've made it through worse," Hollis said, checking the spare ammunition in his belt. "Yeah," Kozak said, "but those times we had more than a pop gun and good intentions." Hollis slid the .38 back into its holster, felt the weight settle against his hip, and looked at the sergeant until the kid stopped fidgeting. "Then, let's hope I don't need to use it," he said quietly. General Major Wilhelm Brandt emerged from the processing tent at 06:45, flanked by two military police corporals who looked bored and cold in equal measure. The general was somewhere in his middle 50s, Hollis guessed, though the war had a way of aging men unpredictably. Some of them came out looking older than Methuselah, while others seemed preserved by the violence, frozen at whatever age they'd been when the shooting started. Brandt fell into neither category. He was simply a man, Prussian straight even with wrist restraints catching the morning light. The kind of officer who probably inspected his bootlaces before surrendering and made sure his uniform was pressed even in defeat. They'd stripped him of insignia and medals, but you could still see the ghost lines on the fabric where decorations had hung, the slightly less faded cloth marking him as someone who'd been important once. He looked at Hollis with the polite contempt of a chess master regarding someone who'd just suggested a game of checkers, his eyes taking in the .38 on Hollis's hip and the mud-spattered jeep and the young nervous sergeant behind the wheel, calculating odds and finding them wanting. "Captain," Brandt said in careful English that carried only a trace of accent, "I am told you will be transporting me to Corps headquarters." "That's correct, General," Hollis replied. 87 miles. Should take us about 4 hours if the roads stay clear and we don't run into anything unexpected." "And if the roads do not stay clear?" Brandt asked. "If we encounter something unexpected?" "Then we'll figure it out as we go," Hollis said, gesturing toward the jeep. "Sergeant Kozak is driving. You'll sit in back. Keep your hands where I can see them. Don't try anything that could be interpreted as hostile. And we'll all get home in time for whatever passes for dinner around here these days." Brandt almost smiled at that, a ghost of humour flickering across his face before discipline reasserted itself. "I have nowhere to run, Captain. My home is likely rubble by now. My family—" He stopped, something shifting behind his eyes, some weight that pressed down on whatever he'd been about to say. "My family is scattered or dead or beyond my reach. I have nowhere to run and no reason to try." They loaded him into the back seat of the jeep, Kozak muttering something in German under his breath that made Brandt's eyebrows rise slightly. Hollis caught the word for traitor and shot Kozak a look that said, "We'll talk about this later when there isn't a prisoner in the vehicle." But the damage was already done. The sergeant's anger was showing, and angry men made mistakes. The jeep coughed to life, 60 horsepower straining under the weight of 2 men plus prisoner plus 40 pounds of extra gear, rations, ammunition, first aid kit, jerry cans of fuel, everything you needed to survive if something went wrong and you ended up spending the night in hostile territory. The morning sat at 42 degrees Fahrenheit according to the thermometer mounted on the command post tent, with fog forecast to burn off by mid-morning. Visibility extended about 2 miles before everything dissolved into grey uncertainty, the kind of weather that made the world feel smaller than it was, like you were driving through a series of rooms instead of across open country. The kind of weather where threats could materialize out of nothing and disappear just as quickly. The first 30 miles passed without incident, which should have been reassuring but somehow wasn't. Hollis had learned not to trust quiet stretches, because quiet stretches were where you let your guard down and started thinking about what you'd do when you got home, what kind of life you'd build in the ruins of whatever this war left behind. Brandt sat in the back seat, watching the destroyed German countryside roll past through the gap in the canvas top, burned-out farmhouses standing like broken teeth against the horizon, cratered roads patched with gravel and prayers, refugees trudging west with everything they owned tied to their backs or piled on carts pulled by horses too old to have been requisitioned by either army. At one point, the general asked about Chicago, mentioned that he'd visited in 1936 for some industrial exposition, something about manufacturing processes and American efficiency. Hollis told him about the stockyards and the lakefront and the way the city smelled like steel and ambition and possibilities, the good and the bad all mixed together into something that was uniquely American. For maybe 15 minutes, they almost had something resembling a conversation between two men who happened to be on opposite sides of history. Then they reached mile marker 34 and the world changed. The roadblock appeared about 100 yards ahead, figures moving in the road, a makeshift barrier constructed from logs and scrap metal and what looked like parts of a destroyed wagon. But something was wrong immediately, something that set off every alarm bell Hollis had developed over 4 years of police work and 2 years of war. The uniforms were wrong, not American olive drab, not the Wehrmacht Feldgrau that you'd expect from regular German army. These were Waffen-SS camouflage patterns, the kind worn by units that were supposed to be elite, but by this point in the war were mostly just fanatics and children too young to know better. 8 or 10 men, Hollis counted, though it was hard to be precise at this distance through the morning haze. Deserters, almost certainly. Trying to liberate German officers from American custody, or maybe just looking for supplies and transport, and willing to kill whoever stood between them and those necessities. Kozak hit the brakes hard enough to throw Hollis forward against the dashboard, the Jeep's bald tires fighting for purchase on the gravel road. "Contact front," Hollis barked, years of training taking over, and he ordered Brandt down into the footwell while stepping out of the vehicle with the .38 visible in his right hand. The SS lieutenant in charge of the roadblock was maybe 30 years old, all bravado and wild eyes, the kind of mid-level fanatic who'd mistaken volume for authority somewhere along the way and never learned any different. The kind of man who was dangerous precisely because he had nothing left to lose and wasn't smart enough to recognize when he was beaten. "The Americans send children with toys," the lieutenant shouted in German loud enough to carry across the distance. Then his eyes found Brandt huddled in the back of the Jeep, and his whole face transformed, lighting up with recognition and something that might have been hope, or might have been desperation, or might have been both things at once. "General Major, we are here to rescue you." His men started moving, spreading out in a loose semicircle around the Jeep, rifles at low ready, professional movements that spoke of training and experience, even if their uniforms were filthy, and their faces showed the hollow-eyed exhaustion of men who'd been running for weeks. Hollis had maybe 10 seconds to decide how this ended, 10 seconds to calculate ranges and angles and probabilities, while part of his brain was screaming that the math didn't work, that 6 rounds against 8 or 10 men was a losing proposition no matter how good a shot you were. But he raised the .38 anyway, not aiming yet, just showing his hand, letting them see that he was armed and willing to use force if forced to use force, and said in his careful phrasebook German that probably had an American accent thick enough to cut with a knife. "This toy holds 6 rounds. I was a Chicago police officer for 4 years before the war. I have never missed a shot inside 20 feet when I meant to hit my target. The first round has your name on it, Lieutenant. Who wants the second one?" The SS lieutenant didn't back down. If anything, Hollis's threat seemed to amuse him, the way a wolf might be amused by a rabbit showing teeth, displaying some spirit before the inevitable conclusion. He barked orders in rapid-fire German, and his men began advancing in that loose semicircle formation, boots crunching on gravel, rifles coming up to firing positions. 8 men minimum, probably 10, 6 rounds in the cylinder. The mathematics of the situation were clear and unfavourable, and everyone standing in that road knew it on some level. But Hollis didn't flinch. He kept the .38 steady, arm extended in a proper weaver stance, his voice calm as a Sunday morning when he said, "I don't want to shoot anyone today. The war is nearly finished. Everyone knows it. You know it. Go home, find your families. See if anything you fought for is still standing. Seems like a remarkably stupid time to die over something that's already decided." Behind him, Kozak had managed to get the M1 carbine out from under his seat, adding 15 rounds of .30 caliber to the tactical equation. Still not enough to win a firefight against 8 or 10 desperate men with rifles, but enough to make the cost of trying prohibitively expensive. The deserters kept coming anyway, close enough now that Hollis could see details, could see the exhaustion etched into their faces, the hollowness around their eyes that spoke of weeks or months spent running and hiding and eating whatever they could steal or scavenge. Dangerous men, because they had nothing left to lose and nowhere left to run. Then Hollis did something that made Kozak's breathing catch in his throat. He lowered the .38 slightly, not holstering it, but relaxing his aim, breaking the confrontational stance, and looked directly at the SS lieutenant with something approaching genuine curiosity on his face. "What's your name?" he asked in German. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through the moment. The lieutenant blinked, thrown completely off whatever script he'd been following, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process this unexpected development. "What?" he finally managed. "Your name," Hollis repeated patiently. "I'm Captain James Hollis, former Chicago Police Department, currently attached to Division Military Police. You want to kill me? Least you can do is introduce yourself first. Seems only polite." The man's face twisted with confusion and anger and something else. Something that might have been the first stirrings of doubt. "Obersturmführer Klaus Roth," he said finally, drawing himself up to attention out of pure habit. "Waffen-SS, das Reich Division. And I do not want to kill you, American. I want General Major Brandt. Release him to our custody, and you may go." "Roth?" Hollis nodded like they'd just been introduced at some formal dinner party instead of in a standoff that could turn lethal in the space between heartbeats. "The war's over, Roth. It's been over since Stalingrad, maybe earlier. You know it. Your men know it. Berlin is about to fall if it hasn't fallen already. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years, and now it's burning. Go home. See if your family's still alive. That's all that matters now." Kozak picked up the thread, his German sharp and fluent, adding emphasis that Hollis's accent couldn't quite manage. "Captain Hollis has never fired his weapon at a prisoner in 2 years of military police work. But he has shot 7 men who gave him no choice, who forced his hand by threatening violence against those he was sworn to protect. 7 rounds fired, 7 hits, 7 men who went home in boxes to mothers who'll never stop crying. He doesn't miss when he pulls the trigger. He doesn't wound by accident. Every round goes exactly where he intends it to go." That part was mostly true. Hollis had stopped prisoner-of-war riots in France and Belgium without ever wounding a bystander, precision fire that dropped ringleaders and froze mobs in their tracks, and the stories had spread through military police companies the way stories always spread, acquiring mythic weight with each retelling until the reality and the legend became impossible to separate. Now Kozak was weaponizing that reputation, using it as a psychological weapon, and Hollis could see it working on some of Roth's men. They were exchanging glances, the kind of looks that said maybe this isn't worth dying for, maybe there's a better way to end this story. But Roth's pride was bleeding out in the road, and desperate men did stupid things to stop the bleeding, to prove to themselves and the world that they still mattered, that their cause wasn't entirely lost. "You cannot stop all of us, American," Roth said, and his voice carried the weight of certain knowledge. "Even if you kill me, my men will cut you down before you can reload. You and your sergeant. You'll die here on this road for a man who would have killed you without hesitation a year ago. Is that truly how you wish this war to end, Obersturmführer?" The voice came from the jeep, command sharp despite the wrist restraints, cutting through the tension like a blade through cloth. General Major Wilhelm Brandt sat up straight in the back seat, every inch the Prussian officer, despite 2 years of losing, despite being a prisoner, despite knowing that the cause he'd served was ash and memory. "I am General Major Brandt, 276th Artillery Division, and I order you to stand down immediately." Roth's face went purple, veins standing out on his forehead like cables under tension. You're a prisoner. You surrendered. You have no authority anymore, no right to give orders. I have the authority of rank and the clarity that comes from understanding that we have lost, Brandt said, switching fully to German now. His voice carrying the weight of every parade ground he'd ever commanded, every inspection he'd ever conducted, 20 years of professional military service compressed into each syllable. "Look at yourself, Obersturmführer. Look at your men. The Führer is hiding in a bunker in Berlin while children and old men die for his delusions of final victory. The Americans are offering you a chance to walk away from this, to survive, to go home and build something from the ruins. Take it. Don't throw your life away for nothing." One of Roth's men, older than the others by maybe a decade, with corporal stripes still visible on his sleeve despite the general filth and wear of his uniform, lowered his rifle. Just a few inches, but enough. Enough to signal that he'd heard what Brandt was saying and was considering it seriously. Then another man did the same, letting the muzzle drop toward the ground. And another. The circle was breaking, discipline eroding under the weight of exhaustion and common sense. Roth could feel his authority crumbling like wet paper in his hands, and his right hand moved toward the Walther P-38 holstered on his hip, fingers closing around the grip in a motion that was either threat or preparation, or both. Hollis's 38 came up fast, hammer already cocked, front sight settling on Roth's center mass with the kind of automatic precision that came from thousands of hours of practice. 18 feet. Optimal range for the weapon and the shooter. The double-action trigger pull on the Model 10 was 12 pounds, heavy enough to prevent accidental discharge but light enough for combat use. But he'd cocked the hammer, engaging single-action mode, which dropped the pull weight to 4 pounds. A breath would set it off at this point. "Don't," Hollis said quietly, his voice carrying despite the low volume. "I gave you a way out, Roth. Don't make me take it back. Don't make me put a round through your chest and explain to your mother why her son died on the side of a road 3 weeks after the war ended." For 11 minutes they stood frozen in that tableau, 0947 to 0958 by Kozak's watch, though it felt like hours compressed into seconds that stretched toward infinity. Sweat ran down Hollis's back despite the 42-degree morning air, soaking through his undershirt and uniform. His trigger finger ached from holding pressure just below the break point, that knife's edge where another ounce of force would send the hammer forward and the round on its way. If Roth drew his weapon, if he cleared leather with that Walther, Hollis would fire and then everything would collapse into chaos, gunfire and screaming and bodies falling while everyone tried to kill everyone else in the handful of seconds before someone's luck ran out. But Roth was reading his men's faces now, seeing the mutiny in their eyes, the way they'd stopped looking at him with respect and started looking at him with the calculation of men deciding whether to follow orders or follow their survival instinct. These weren't the fanatical SS troops of 41 or 42, the true believers who'd march into hell singing hymns to the Führer. These were scared kids in frightening uniforms, playing soldier until someone called their bluff, and Hollis had just called it with 6 rounds of calm, cold certainty. Roth cursed, something vicious in Bavarian dialect about Americans and cowards and the fall of the Reich, but his hand came away from the Walter empty. He spat in the dirt at Hollis's feet, a gesture of contempt that meant nothing and changed nothing, then turned on his heel and stalked toward the tree line. His men followed, melting into the forest like wolves slipping back into shadows, and within 30 seconds the road was empty except for tire tracks in the mud and the fading adrenaline that made Hollis's hands want to shake. He exhaled slowly, carefully lowered the hammer on the .38 and holstered the weapon with fingers that felt disconnected from his body. The shaking didn't start until 5 miles later, when Kozak finally spoke and broke the silence that had wrapped around them like cotton. "You think they'll come back?" the sergeant asked, his voice tight and controlled. "Try again down the road somewhere?" "No," Hollis said, watching the destroyed countryside roll past. "They just wanted permission to quit fighting. We gave it to them. Sometimes that's all it takes." Brandt remained quiet for the next 10 miles, staring out at the ruined landscape like a man studying his own autopsy results, watching his country die in real time through the gap in the canvas top. Farmhouses reduced to chimney stacks, standing alone in fields of ash. Orchards shredded by artillery fire, broken branches reaching toward a sky that didn't care. Refugees trudging west with hollow eyes, and everything they owned tied in bedsheets or loaded on carts, joining the great migration of displaced humanity that was reshaping Europe whether anyone wanted it to or not. The Germany he'd fought to preserve was already gone, replaced by something none of them could quite name yet. Finally he spoke, his voice careful and measured. "Why did you not shoot, Captain? When you had clear justification and no one would have questioned your decision?" Hollis kept his eyes on the road ahead, watching for potholes and obstacles. "Because I didn't have to," he said simply. "That is not an answer," Brandt replied. "You had clear legal justification. Obersturmführer Roth was threatening a military operation, attempting to liberate a prisoner, endangering American personnel. Any court would have absolved you of wrongdoing. The paperwork would have been simple." "Maybe," Hollis said, adjusting his grip on the Jeep's frame as Kozak swerved around a crater that had taken out half the road surface. "But I'd still have to write a letter to his mother explaining why her son died. Already wrote one of those letters last November. Don't particularly want to write another if I can avoid it." The air in the Jeep changed suddenly, pressure dropping like before a storm. Brandt went very still in the back seat, his breathing shallow and controlled. "Your brother?" he asked quietly. "Infantry," Hollis confirmed, his voice staying level and professional the way it always did when he talked about Tommy, like he was filing an official report instead of describing how his chest had caved in when the telegram arrived. "Staff Sergeant Thomas Hollis, 2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry. Hurtgen Forest, November 8th. Sniper got him while he was carrying a wounded soldier back to the aid station. He was 23 years old, 5 days past his birthday. Got a bronze star for it. Mum keeps it on the mantel next to his picture. Can't look at it without crying, probably never will." Brandt said nothing for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "My son," he said carefully, as if testing each word before releasing it. "Hans Brandt, 21 years old, bombardier in a Heinkel 111. RAF Spitfires caught his squadron over Kent in July of '43. They said it was quick, that he wouldn't have suffered. I do not know if that was kindness or truth or simply what they tell fathers so they can sleep at night." Kozak glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable, rage and grief and something else all mixed together in a way that probably hurt to look at too closely. The Jeep hummed along Highway 17, engine noise filling the space where words should have been. Two men who'd spent years trying to kill each other's countries, sitting 6 feet apart and connected by the one loss that transcended every border and uniform and ideology. "I saw the camps," Brandt said suddenly, like a confession he'd been holding behind his teeth for months and couldn't contain anymore. Not the worst ones, perhaps, but I saw enough. Dachau, when we moved through in 43, the trains arriving, the smoke from the crematoria, the way the guards wouldn't meet your eyes if you looked at them too directly. He stared at his cuffed hands like they belonged to someone else. I told myself it was necessary. Brutal, yes, but necessary for final victory. War requires hard choices, I said to myself. Someone must make them, and better that I not look too closely at the details. And now, Hollis asked, keeping his voice neutral. Now my family is missing or dead or scattered across a continent that barely exists anymore. My country is burning. My cause is ash. And I wonder, Brandt's voice cracked slightly, the first time his Prussian armour had shown a seam, I wonder if I was simply a fool. If I chose not to see because seeing would have meant choosing between my oath and my soul, and I wasn't brave enough to make that choice. If I was so focused on calculating trajectories and blast radii and acceptable losses that I refused to calculate the mathematics of my own complicity. Kozak's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and Hollis could feel the anger radiating off him like heat from an engine block. The rage that wanted simple vengeance for complicated evil, that wanted to turn around and put a round through Brandt's skull and call it justice. But this wasn't the time for that fight. Maybe there would never be a time for that fight, or maybe the fight would last decades and take forms none of them could predict. I became a cop to protect people, Hollis said carefully, choosing his words like he was walking through a minefield. I walked Chicago's South Side for 4 years before the war, broke up domestic fights, talked down drunks who were waving guns around, pulled kids out of bad situations before they became worse situations. Then the war started, and suddenly I'm guarding men who helped build a system that murdered millions, and part of me wants to just shoot them and be done with it. Call it justice or vengeance or whatever word makes me sleep at night. He pulled out his canteen, took a drink of water that tasted like metal and chemicals, offered it to Brandt, who declined with a shake of his head. But my father taught me something when I was 16 years old and thought I knew everything about the world, Hollis continued. He was a railroad worker, spent 30 years laying track across the Midwest, and one night after I'd gotten into a fight with some kid who'd called me a name I didn't like, he sat me down and said, "The law isn't always right, son. Sometimes it's stupid or cruel or both, but it's all we've got standing between us and animals. So we follow it, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts, because that's when it matters most." They reached a United States checkpoint at mile marker 61, a 101st Airborne Mobile Command Post set up at a crossroads, coordinates 48.1 degrees north, 10.8 degrees east according to the map Hollis consulted. Hot coffee in tin cups that burned your fingers if you held them wrong. K rations that tasted like salted cardboard but filled the hole in your stomach. 15-minute rest stop while an infantry captain verified Brandt's transfer orders and made sure the paperwork was in order, because even at the end of the world, the army still cared about paperwork. The clouds were breaking up now, morning sun burning through the fog, temperature climbing toward 48 degrees, the kind of spring morning that made you believe the world might actually heal someday if given enough time and mercy. An infantry major with mud on his boots and exhaustion in his eyes saw the 38 on Hollis's hip and grinned that knowing grin. "That's your sidearm, Captain. My grandmother carries bigger protection when she goes to church." Several other soldiers laughed because mocking each other's equipment was how soldiers bonded. Before Hollis could respond, Brandt spoke up from where he sat in the back of the jeep, his English careful and precise. "Your captain is a skilled man," he said loud enough to carry. "I have seen his skill demonstrated under conditions that would have broken lesser men. Perhaps you should ask him to teach you what true skill looks like, rather than mocking weapons you do not understand." The major's grin died like someone had flipped a switch. He mumbled something about checking the perimeter and walked away quickly, leaving an uncomfortable silence behind. Kozak nearly choked on his coffee, coughing and sputtering while Hollis tried not to smile. They climbed back into the jeep 5 minutes later, 61 miles down, 26 to go. The road ahead looked clear for the first time that morning, stretching away toward Munich in a relatively straight line. For the first time since dawn, Hollis allowed himself a moment of hope, the dangerous kind that made you lower your guard and start thinking about hot meals and clean sheets. That was when the artillery fire started in the distance, deep booming thunder that made the ground shiver, and everything went to hell again. Mile 68. The artillery was closer now, German 88s by the sound of them, not American 105s, and Kozak slowed the jeep as black smoke rose from the tree line 2 miles to the east. An infantry runner flagged them down before they reached the next checkpoint, his uniform spattered with what might have been mud, or might have been blood, or might have been both. "Roads cut up ahead, Captain," he said, breathing hard like he'd run the whole distance. SS Kampfgruppe broke through our lines this morning, maybe 100 men, overran a field hospital and took American wounded as hostages. Divisions sealing the breach, but it's going to take hours, maybe half a day. You need to backtrack to the last major intersection, head west on the secondary route, add 30 miles to your trip, but at least you'll get there alive. Hollis pulled out his map, spread it across the jeep's hood, traced the options with fingers that were steadier than they had any right to be. Backtrack 40 miles, add 3 hours minimum to the journey, arrive after dark when every shadow could hide threats. Or, his finger stopped on a thin grey line cutting through the forest, take the logging trail. Unmapped terrain except for this notation, possibly mined, definitely not cleared by combat engineers, but it would cut 8 miles off the distance and keep them moving forward instead of backward. "What do you think?" he asked Kozak. The sergeant stared at the map like it was a death warrant written in contour lines and elevation marks. "I think we should wait for armor support, sir. Let the tanks punch through, then we follow in their wake like sensible people who want to see tomorrow." "Waiting could take 6 hours, Hollis said. Could take more. Could also mean we're sitting ducks if those SS troops start ranging wider." "True," Kozak admitted. "But that logging trail could have landmines, could have more deserters waiting in ambush, could have 100 things that turn us into red mist before we even see them coming." Hollis looked back at Brandt. The general was watching him with those calculating eyes, the kind that had spent 20 years measuring trajectories and acceptable losses and strategic value against tactical risk. "What would you do, General?" Hollis asked. "If you were in my position, I would assess the strategic value of the prisoner against the tactical risk of unsecured terrain," Brandt said slowly. "But I suspect you are not asking me for strategic advice, Captain. You are asking if I am worth the gamble, if the information I carry justifies risking 2 American lives on an unknown road." "Are you worth it?" Hollis asked bluntly. Brandt's eyes flicked to the smoke rising in the east, then back to meet Hollis's gaze steadily. Something passed between them, an understanding built on the last 3 hours of careful conversation and shared grief. "I know where 3 SS commanders are hiding, waiting to slip away and disappear into civilian life with their crimes unpunished. I know which Wehrmacht officers will testify against war criminals if given immunity and protection. I know locations of munitions dumps large enough to level city blocks if they fall into the wrong hands." He paused. "I am worth the gamble, Captain, but only if you believe I will honor my word and cooperate fully. Only if you trust that I'm telling the truth." Hollis made the decision in about 5 seconds, which was probably 4 seconds longer than he actually needed. "We go through," he said. "Stay sharp, watch for any disturbance in the road surface, and if anything looks wrong, we back out immediately. No heroes, no unnecessary risks." Kozak muttered something in German that probably wasn't complimentary to anyone's intelligence or ancestry, but he turned the jeep onto the logging trail without further argument, because arguing with officers rarely accomplished anything productive. The forest swallowed them within 50 yards, thick black pines that filtered the afternoon light into cathedral dimness, turning the world green and grey and full of shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't move. Tree roots heaved up through the trail like arthritic fingers reaching for something they'd never quite grasp. The Jeep crawled forward at 15 miles per hour, engine whining in first gear, every bump and pothole a potential trigger for something buried and explosive, every shadow a potential hiding place for men with guns and bad intentions. They made it 3 miles before everything fell apart. Mile 71. Movement in the shadows. Shapes that moved wrong, too deliberate, too coordinated to be animals or refugees. American uniforms, but the postures were all wrong, too rigid, too formal. Wehrmacht discipline showing through captured clothing like bone through torn flesh. Hollis opened his mouth to order everyone down when the rifle cracked, impossibly loud in the confined space of the forest trail. The bullet punched through the Jeep's windshield, missed Kozak by maybe 3 inches, and the sergeant jerked the wheel hard to the right on pure instinct. The Jeep slewed sideways, hit a root the size of a man's thigh, and flipped into a ditch at 20 miles per hour, rolling once before slamming into a tree with a sound like the end of the world. Hollis was thrown clear, airborne for what felt like minutes, but was probably less than a second, and landed hard on his left shoulder in a bed of pine needles and broken branches. The .38 was somehow still in his hand, because muscle memory didn't care about physics or momentum or the laws of motion. When he looked up, stars still dancing at the edges of his vision, 3 men in American uniforms were dragging Brandt out of the overturned Jeep. They were shouting in German about traitors and collaboration and justice, their voices high and cracking with exhaustion and fear and something that might have been righteousness. One of them couldn't have been more than 19 years old, all gangly limbs and peach fuzz, wearing an oversized uniform that had probably been stripped from a dead GI, pulled a Luger P08 from his belt and pressed it against Brandt's temple with shaking hands. "This is what happens to traitors who surrender to the Americans," the boy screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "This is what happens to generals who forget their oaths and their duty." Hollis shouted halt in German, the word coming out wrong because his mouth was full of blood from biting his tongue during the crash, but they didn't stop. The boy's finger was tightening on the Luger's trigger, and Hollis had maybe 2 seconds to make a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life, however long or short that turned out to be. His .38 came up smooth and practiced, 1,000 hours of Chicago PD range time compressed into one fluid motion that bypassed conscious thought entirely. Front sight settling on the boy's right shoulder, not center mass, not the head, not the lethal zones that were drilled into every shooter, just the shoulder, because maybe, just maybe, he could end this without creating another mother who'd spend the rest of her life crying over a folded flag. The range was 23 feet according to the measurement he'd pace out later. The angle was roughly 17 degrees off perpendicular. The hammer fell, the round left the barrel at roughly 900 feet per second, and the boy screamed as the bullet punched through muscle and tendon and bone. He dropped the Luger, staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, blood streaming between his fingers, but not arterial, not immediately fatal, just pain and shock, and the sudden understanding that war wasn't a game anymore, that bullets hurt in ways movies never showed you. The other 2 Germans froze, caught between training that said fight and survival instinct that said run. Hollis was already rolling behind a fallen log, .38 tracking, 5 rounds left in the cylinder, trying to process targets and threats while his head still rang from the crash. Kozak had his M1 carbine out now, dazed but functional, adding 15 rounds of covering fire to the equation. And Brandt, hands still cuffed, kicked one of the Germans in the knee with surprising force for a man his age, dropping him hard onto the forest floor. "Next round goes center mass," Hollis shouted in German, trying to make his voice carry the weight of absolute certainty. "Drop your weapons now. Put them down and walk away." They did, hands coming up slowly, rifles clattering onto the pine needles, the fight draining out of them like water from a punctured canteen. The wounded boy was crying now, that high, keening sound young men make when they realize they're not immortal after all, that their mothers were right about war being hell. Hollis moved to him carefully, .38 still drawn but pointed at the ground now, threat assessment processing all the variables, and knelt beside him in the dirt. The shoulder wound was clean, through and through, missing the brachial artery by what looked like maybe half an inch. The kind of wound that would hurt like hell for months and leave a scar that would never quite fade, but survivable with basic first aid and competent medical treatment. "Hold still," Hollis said in German, pulling the first aid kit from his belt with his free hand. The boy flinched away, eyes wide with fear that overrode pain for the moment. "I'm not going to hurt you anymore," Hollis said quietly. "Already did that part. Now I'm going to make sure you don't die from it." He worked quickly, hands steady despite the adrenaline crash that was starting to hit his system. Sulfur powder dumped liberally on both entry and exit wounds to prevent infection. Pressure bandages wrapped tight enough to slow the bleeding without cutting off circulation entirely. Morphine syrette jabbed into the meat of the boy's thigh, a quarter grain of pharmaceutical mercy that would take the edge off the pain and quiet the screaming. The kid's breathing steadied as the drug hit his system, tears still streaming down his face but the panic ebbing into shock-induced calm. "Dresden," the boy whispered through chattering teeth. "I'm from Dresden. Haven't heard from my family since February, since the bombing, since the firestorm that ate the city." His voice broke into fragments. "I just want to go home. I just want to know if they're still alive. If there's anything left to go home to." Hollis thought about Tommy lying in a military cemetery in Belgium, about Brant's son burning over Kent, about all the mothers across all the countries who would never get their boys back, who would spend the rest of their lives staring at photographs and wondering what might have been. He thought about the letter he'd almost mailed last week, the one where he'd told his mother he didn't know what he was doing anymore, that he wasn't sure any of this meant anything or accomplished anything beyond creating more grief. He'd torn it up because admitting doubt felt like betraying everyone who'd already paid the price, but the doubt was still there, sitting in his chest like undigested food. "You'll live," Hollis said quietly, checking the bandages one more time before standing up. "The war is almost over, maybe days now, maybe hours. Go find your family. Go build something better than what we destroyed." Kozak got the jeep running through some mechanical miracle. The frame bent, but the engine still sound, good enough to limp the remaining 16 miles if they took it slow and avoided anything resembling rough terrain. They loaded Brant back into the vehicle, left the 3 Germans sitting by the side of the trail with their wounded friend and enough medical supplies to get them to a collection point or field hospital. The boy watched them drive away with eyes that would probably replay this moment for decades, in dreams and nightmares and quiet moments when the past refused to stay buried. They reached division headquarters at 16:40 hours, 4 hours late and covered in mud and blood and bruises and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from spending an entire day thinking you might die. Hollis delivered Brant to intelligence officers working out of a concrete building that had been a schoolhouse before the war, handing over custody with paperwork that documented every mile and every incident. He surrendered his .38 for ballistics examination, standard procedure after any weapons discharge, no exceptions even for captains, even when you saved lives instead of taking them. His colonel was waiting in the hallway, face like a thundercloud at sunset. "You endangered a high-value intelligence asset," Colonel Bradford said, his voice cold enough to freeze water. "You took an unsecured route without authorization, engaged in combat with enemy forces in an unauthorized operation, and discharged your weapon, creating potential international incident complications. You're on administrative leave pending formal inquiry. Dismissed, Captain." Hollis saluted, said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse, and walked out to the motor pool where Kozak was already on his 3rd cigarette and staring at nothing in particular. They sat on the jeep's bent hood while the sun set over Bavaria, painting the ruins gold and crimson like the world was trying to make devastation beautiful, trying to convince everyone that this all meant something. "You did the right thing," Kozak said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them like wire. "Back there with that kid. You could have killed him, centre mass, and nobody would have questioned it. But you didn't." The sergeant flicked ash into the dirt. That has to count for something in the grand scheme of things. Has to matter somehow. Does it? Hollis asked, not really expecting an answer. Or are we just telling ourselves stories so we can sleep at night? That night, Hollis sat in his billet, trying to write a letter to his mother, trying to explain what had happened without worrying her, trying to process his own thoughts through the act of putting them on paper. He told her he'd shot a man today. A boy, really. First time since Belgium in '44. Said he was tired in ways that sleep didn't fix. Said he didn't know what he was doing anymore, whether showing mercy was strength or just cowardice, wearing a more acceptable uniform. He got 3 paragraphs in before he crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash. Some truths were too heavy to mail home, too complicated to explain to people who hadn't been here, hadn't seen what war actually looked like up close. April 24th, 0800 hours. Hollis was summoned to Colonel Bradford's office expecting a formal reprimand at minimum, possibly court-martial proceedings for disobeying orders and endangering personnel. Instead, he found Brandt there, cleaned up and wearing a fresh Wehrmacht uniform without insignia, and an intelligence captain with a stack of translated reports spread across Bradford's desk like evidence in a trial. General Major Brandt has been extraordinarily cooperative, the intelligence captain said, tapping the reports with one finger. Locations of 3 SS commanders currently in hiding throughout Bavaria. Detailed maps of munitions dumps and supply caches. Names of Wehrmacht officers willing to testify against war criminals in exchange for immunity and protection for their families. His information has already led to 2 major arrests and prevented what could have been significant civilian casualties. He's potentially saved hundreds of lives with what he's told us. Bradford looked like he'd swallowed something deeply unpleasant, but was too professional to complain about the taste. The general says you're the reason he's talking, Captain. Says something about your conduct convinced him that cooperation was both morally necessary and practically beneficial. Brandt stood, formal and precise despite everything, despite being a prisoner, despite his world ending. Through the interpreter he said carefully, "Captain Hollis spared the boy in the forest yesterday. I have seen many officers, German and American alike, who would have killed him for convenience, for safety, for the simple reason that dead men require less paperwork and fewer awkward questions than wounded ones. Captain Hollis did not take that path. He chose the harder option, the one that required more skill and carried more risk. That is when I understood that not all soldiers are the same, that some still fight for principles beyond mere victory. Some still see the humanity in their enemies." The interpreter's voice stayed level and professional, but Hollis heard the weight underneath every word. Brandt was offering absolution for a choice Hollis hadn't known he needed absolved, validation for the doubt that had been eating at him since he pulled that trigger. Bradford cleared his throat uncomfortably, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. "You're cleared of all charges, Captain,"